Chapter 38. Horace sensed the presence of someone directly behind him and pivoted rapidly, his sword swinging back, ready to cut side-handed. Seeing the slightly built form of his friend there, grimly engaging a Temujai swordsman with his two knives, he widened his stroke and laid open the Temuj's forehead with the point of his sword. The trooper staggered away, hands to his face, sinking to his knees. "What do you think you're up to?" Horace yelled, in between parrying another attack from the front. "I'm watching your back," Will told him, as he blocked a thrust from another Temuj trying to take Horace from the rear. "Well, next time, let me know," Horace said, grunting as he sidestepped a lance and hammered the hilt of his sword into its surprised owner's skull. "I nearly cut you in half just then." "There won't be a next time," Will replied. "I'm not enjoying myself here." Horace flicked a rapid glance over his shoulder. Will was using the ranger's double knife defense to parry and block the Temuj's saber. But it wasn't a form of fighting he was particularly skilled in. Besides, it had been over a year since he and Horace had practiced the moves in the hills of Celtica. The Temujai swordsman was having the better of the exchange, and in that quick glance, Horace had seen blood seeping through the left arm of Will's shirt. "When I tell you, drop to your knees," Horace said. "Fine," Will replied grimly. "I may even do it before you give the word." In spite of himself, Horace grinned. Then, as he drove two attackers back, he called over his shoulder, "Now!" He sensed that Will had dropped to the ground, and, flicking the sword into a reversed grip, he thrust backwards and heard a startled cry. "You all right?" he called, reversing the sword again, and deflecting that persistent lance once more. For a moment there was no answer, and he felt a sudden jolt of fear that he had just stabbed his friend. Then Will answered him. "Very impressive. Where did you learn that?" "Made it up just now," Horace said, then grunted in satisfaction as the lancer stepped a little too close and took the point of his sword in the shoulder. As the man sank to the ground, Horace withdrew the sword, flicking it into a whirling overhand cut at another Temuj. The cavalryman's thick felt helmet saved his life as the sword crashed down on it. But there was still enough force in the blow to knock him to his knees, concussed and cross-eyed. For a moment they had a brief respite. Horace stepped back and studied his friend. "Is that arm troubling you?" He nodded towards the widening seep of blood on Will's sleeve. Looking down, Will seemed to notice it for the first time. "I didn't even feel it," he said in some surprise. Horace grinned mirthlessly. "You will later," he told him. Will shook his head doubtfully. "If there is a later," he said. Then, from the lines behind them, they heard the thrum of bowstrings and the hissing flight of another volley. They looked at one another in amazement. "It's Evanlyn," said Will. "She's still got them firing." Horace gestured to the swarming Temujai, surrounding the thin lines of defenders who were keeping them out of the archers' redoubt. "She won't for much longer," he said. The Skandian line was already beginning to buckle. "Come on, watch my back and yell if you get in trouble." And with that, he bounded down the slope, his sword rising and falling as he drove his attack into the rear of the Temujai. Startled at the ferocity of his assault, they gave ground for a few seconds. Then, seeing the new assault consisted of only two men, one of them armed only with knives and small enough to be a boy, they rallied and drove forward again. Horace fought grimly, gathering the few remaining defenders around him. But the enemy numbers were beginning to tell, and now individual Temujai were bypassing the small knot of defenders and dropping into the trench itself, where the archers were still sending their volleys into the main Temujai force. The two boys heard Evanlyn's voice raised in urgent tones as she directed some of the archers to fire point blank at the attackers. They knew it was a matter of minutes before the Temujai overran the trench and killed everyone in it. "Come on," said Will, leading the way towards the trench. Horace followed close behind him. A Temujai warrior barred his way, and he struck at the man with his sax knife, feeling the blow jar all the way up his arm as it struck home. A warning cry from Horace alerted him to danger, and he turned just in time to block a savage saber cut with his crossed knives. Then Horace was by his side, slashing at the man who had attacked him, and the three others with him. The two friends fought side by side, but there were too many of the Temujai. Will's heart sank as he realized they were not going to reach the trench in time. He could see Evanlyn, not 20 meters away, with a group of archers around her, facing a still larger group of Temujai as they advanced up the trench, moving slowly, held back only by the threat of the bows. "Look out, Will!" It was Horace again, and once more they were fighting for their lives as more of the Temujai swarmed towards them. Nitzak led a party of men into the trenches that had sheltered the Skandian archers. His other men could take care of the two young warriors who had counter-attacked so effectively. His task was to silence the archers once and for all. His men poured into the trench behind him, striking out at the unarmoured, virtually unarmed bowmen. They retreated down the line of the earthworks, some of them scrambling up and over and running to the rear. Grimly, Nitzak followed until, rounding an angle in the trench, he stopped in surprise. There was a young girl facing him, a long dagger in her hand and a look of total defiance in her eyes. The remaining archers gathered protectively around her. Then, on her command, they brought up their bows to the present position. The two groups faced each other. There were at least 10 bows aimed at him, Nitzak saw, at a range of barely 10 meters. If the girl gave the order, there was no way the archers could miss. Yet, once that first volley was released, the girl and her archers would be helpless. He flicked his eyes sideways. His men were level with him, and there were more behind. He had no intention of dying under the Skandian volley. If it might serve a purpose, he would do so willingly. But he had a job to do, and he didn't have the right to die until that job was done. On the other hand, he had no qualms about sacrificing 10 or 12 of his own men, if necessary, to get that job done. He gestured them forward. "Attack," he said calmly, and his men surged forward in the constricted space of the trench. There was a second's hesitation, then he heard the girl's command to shoot, and the instant thrum of the bowstrings. The arrows tore into his men, killing or wounding 7 of them. But the others kept on, joined by more men from behind him, and the archers broke and ran, leaving only the girl to face him. Nitzak stepped forward, raising the saber in both hands. Curious, he studied her eyes for some sign of fear and saw none there. It would be almost a shame to kill one so brave, he thought. Off to one side, he heard an agonized cry, a young man's voice that broke with fear and pain. "Evanlyn!" He assumed it must be the girl's name. He saw her eyes flick away from his, and then she smiled sadly at someone out of his view. It was a smile of farewell. Will had witnessed it all. Helpless to intervene, fighting desperately to protect Horace's back and his own life, he had seen the Temujai move up the trench, saw the archers threaten them with a point-blank volley, and then watched, horrified, as the Temujai calmly moved forward once more, oblivious to the danger. The final volley stopped them for a second or two. Then they charged, sweeping the archers away before them. Horace's urgent warning brought him back into his own situation, and he darted sideways to avoid a sabre, jabbing with the sax to drive the off-balanced Temuj back a few paces. He turned to look again and saw a Temujai officer poised over Evanlyn, his sword held in two hands as he raised it. "Evanlyn!" he cried in torment, and, hearing him, she turned, met his agonized gaze, and smiled at him. A smile that remembered all they had been through together in the past 11 months. A smile that remembered all they had ever meant to each other. And in that moment, he couldn't let her die. He spun the sax knife in his hand, catching it by the point, feeling the balance, then brought his arm back, then forward in one fluid movement. The big knife took Nitzak under the left arm just before he began his downward cut. His eyes glazed, and he crumpled slowly to one side, lurching against the earth wall of the trench, then sliding down to the hard-packed earthen floor. The sabre fell from his hands, and he plucked with weakened fingers at the heavy knife in his side. His last thought was that now Hazkam would probably abandon the invasion after all, and he was angry about that. Will, now unarmed except for his small throwing knife, was under attack once more. He leaped forward to grapple with the Temuj, and they rolled down the earthen slope together, with Will clinging desperately to the man's sword arm, while he, in his turn, tried to avoid the ineffectual slashing attacks Will made with the small knife. He saw Horace overwhelmed by 4 warriors attacking him at once, and he realized that, finally, it was all over. And then he heard a blood-chilling roar, and a huge figure was standing over him, literally plucking his adversary from the ground and throwing him 12 meters down the slope, to send another 3 men sprawling under the impact. It was Ragnak, terrifying in his berserker rage. His shirt had been torn to ribbons, and he wore no armor save his massive, horned helmet. The horrifying roaring noise came constantly from his throat as he plunged into the midst of the Temujai attackers, the huge, double-bladed axe whirling in giant circles as he struck his enemies down on either side. He made no effort to protect himself, and he was cut and wounded over and again. He simply ignored the fact and cut and hacked and beat at the men who had invaded his country, who had dared to awaken the berserker rage in his blood. His personal guard followed him, each man in the same awful killing rage. They drove a wedge into the Temujai force, implacable, irresistible. 12 men who didn't care if they lived or died, who cared about one thing and one thing only: getting close to their enemies and killing them, as many as possible, as quickly as possible. "Horace!" Will croaked, and tried to scramble to his feet, remembering that last image of Horace desperately holding off 4 attackers. And then he heard another sound, a familiar one this time. It was the deep-throated thrum of a longbow, and, as he watched, Horace's attackers seemed to fade away like snow in the sunshine, and he knew that Halt had arrived. On a knoll a kilometre away, Hazkam, general of the army and Shan of the people, watched his attack fail. The enemy's left flank had curled around to crash into his main force, buckling them and driving them back, causing severe losses. On the enemy's right flank, Nitzak and his men had finally managed to silence the Skandian archers. In his heart, he had always known that his old friend would succeed in the task. But he had taken too long over it. The success had come too late, after his main force had been demoralized and disorganized by the constant hail of arrows. After they had been driven back in confusion by that flanking attack. It was just one failed attack, of course, and he knew he could still win this battle if he chose to. He could regroup his Uhlans, commit his fresh reserves, and drive these damned Skandians out from behind their defences, and send them scattering into the hills and the trees. For a moment he was tempted to do it, to have a savage revenge on these people who had thwarted his plans. But the cost would be too high. He had lost thousands of men already, and another attack, even a successful one, would cost him more than he could afford. He turned in his saddle and beckoned the bugler forward. "Sound the general withdrawal," he said calmly. His face gave no hint of the seething fury, the bitter rage of failure that burned in his heart. It was not polite for a Temujai general to allow his emotions to show.